This is our third talk that's sponsored by the Ethnic and Gender Studies Institute this term. So today we're happy to welcome Junia Joplin. She's going to speak with us, and her talk is entitled The Three Graces of Transition. And joining us as well, we have Dr. Wendy Crosby from the Religious Studies Department, and she's just going to help us field questions towards the end. She's going to moderate the discussion or any discussion that comes up after Junia Joplin's talk. So I'll turn off my camera and let's all welcome Junia Joplin, and she'll, talk us through some issues. So welcome.
All right, I'm up, I guess, right? All right, well, thanks for the welcome and thanks for inviting me. My name is Junia Joplin. I'm someone with a background in Christian ministry, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But I just want to say, before I really jump into that, just a word of encouragement to all of you who are studying during this season of COVID. I just had parent-teacher reviews for my two kids last week, one of whom may walk through the door any second now. And my youngest son's teacher said, he's probably about 10 years older than me, and said, if I were in the student's seat and I were having to figure out how to study during these different conditions, this like kind of new normal, everybody calls it, I don't know if I could do it. So you all deserve a lot of credit and kudos for what you're doing, and hopefully it won't be forever. But so I'm just going to jump right in. The 19th century Italian sculptor Antonio Canova completed a neoclassical masterpiece back in 1817. Canova's sculpture, carved out of marble, depicts three women, Euphrosyne, Algea, and Thalia. Euphrosyne's name means joy, Algea's name means shining, and Thalia's name means blooming. And these women are otherwise known as the Three Graces, or the Three Charities. In mythology, the Graces were said to represent something like youth and beauty, mirth and elegance. They're often said to be daughters of Zeus, the ruler of the gods. Sometimes the story changed up a little bit. That's generally what they were called. And the sculpture is beautiful. I first became familiar with it when I lived in Richmond, Virginia. There's a reproduction of the Three Graces right in the yard outside of a historic estate that has been converted into a public park. The sisters appear again and again and again in art. Luminaries such as Rubens and Picasso and Cézanne have created depictions of the Three Graces. The contemporary artist, Kehinde Wiley, who I love, and some of you may recognize as the painter behind the official portrait of President Barack Obama in the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. Wiley's actually given us a variation of the Three Graces, as each of them as contemporary Black men. That's kind of the way Wiley works. That is his signature style. The three young men share a kind of loose embrace, as the Three Graces tend to, except whereas the Graces are usually depicted naked, Wiley's Graces wear a Boston Celtics jersey, a flowing pinstripe baseball jersey, and an Atlanta Hawks jacket. And there's this provocative interplay between the classical and the contemporary. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorites, but I love almost everything he does. So I'm not here to give an art lecture. Even as an art major back in the day, I can remember struggling to stay awake through some of those, especially if they happened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I was an undergraduate student. But I do want to borrow from that ancient motif this afternoon, the motif of three embracing figures, the three sisters or three siblings. When I was a little girl growing up on a small working farm in western North Carolina, we grew crops that I later discovered had been nicknamed the Three Sisters by First Nations people: corn, squash, and beans. The three types of plants complement one another so well, they form an almost symbiotic relationship as they thrive and grow together. The necklace that I'm wearing, which is very tiny in your screens, I'm sure, depicts three mountain peaks out in the Canadian Rockies, right near the border of Alberta and British Columbia. Both settlers and First Nations people refer to these peaks as the Three Sisters. And I wear this in part because I am one of three sisters. As a Christian minister and student of the scriptures, I operate in a world where 3 is a very important number. We confess that God somehow is 3 figures. And the most familiar way of describing these 3 figures, a way that assigns them gender, even though they are technically genderless, would be Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Some people say Creator, Christ, and Holy Spirit. Some people use other language still. But beyond the obvious connection to the Trinity, the scriptures give us other versions of 3 figures. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, names a Christian version of the 3 charities, faith, hope, and love. And I can't help but wonder if there isn't some thematic connection between the 3 classical graces and the 3 daughters born to Job at the end of the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible. The daughters are the only members of Job's family that are mentioned by name. Their names are Jemima, which means dove, Kezia, which is the name Keisha comes from it, and it means something like cinnamon, and Karen Hapuk, whose name means something like eyeliner, which I absolutely love. Dove, cinnamon, and eyeliner are described as the most beautiful women in the land, and in a stroke for women's equality, they are each given an equal share of Job's inheritance with their brothers. So as a Christian minister who's a transgender woman, I read Job as kind of a story of transition. There's something about the presence of these 3 women in Job's life that signifies his transformation. What we're seeing at the end of the book is something more than simply the restoration of Job's lost fortune. Job's daughters, women who bear striking resemblances to Euphrosyne, Algea, and Thalia, seem to suggest that their father has become someone new, someone who sees and experiences life very differently than before. I'm a big fan of William Blake's art based on the book of Job, and there is one of the last pieces that Blake did on the book of Job is Job and his daughters, and the 3 daughters look an awful lot like the 3 graces in his artwork. All this introduction is to say that I'm captivated by this idea of carrying 3 graces with me along my own journey of transition. And I'm indebted to this grand mythology that we find in Canova's marble and in First Nations gardening hacks and in the Hebrew scriptures even for the gift of a beautiful metaphor. So today I want to talk a little bit about what I think of as 3 graces of transition, 3 virtues, 3 values that I have sought to embody in my coming out and transitioning. And those are vulnerability, authenticity, and visibility. Right after I came out, I was constantly having to face questions asked by my congregation. I was on the hot seat for most of the 5 weeks between when I preached my coming out sermon and when I got fired. And once I got fired, that's when I started getting all these requests for interviews and conversations and panels and podcasts and stuff like that. And what I've noticed during all these conversations, often very intense conversations, is that those 3 topics kept reappearing: vulnerability, authenticity, and visibility. And so when Dr. Harper asked me more than a month ago for a title for my lecture today, those 3 ideas felt appropriate. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just telling my story, and I hope the presence of those 3 kind of virtues is evident. And I'm going to tell it as best I can. And we can think together about where those things show up. But I do want to offer a disclaimer, one that almost goes without saying. I speak for myself. I've spent a lot of time the last couple of years reading as much about transition and gender theory as I can get my hands on, from trans memoirists to historians to academics. I've gotten to know lots of trans people in person and on social media. Sarah McBride, now the highest ranking trans elected official in America, followed me on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and I am starstruck. I have my own personal experiences of transition to draw from, but I'm not an expert, and I can't possibly speak in such a way as to reflect the full experiences of transness, because that's impossible. As I prepared to come out, as I got closer to the day that I would come out, some of my trans women friends told me to be ready for the spotlight. One social media friend, an activist and writer in Utah, told me about what it was like to talk to the media after she came out. And she said, "You are white, you are pretty and kind of cis-passable. You have something of a public profession and you've been fairly successful at it. You need to be ready for the Canadian version of Good Morning America to call you." And she was right, it turns out. She also cautioned me to be careful and to recognize the biases that center voices like mine to the exclusion of other trans voices sometimes, and to just to stick with my own personal experience. Another trans woman messaged me to lament the way that newly out people like myself draw the attention of cisgender audiences, and how we're often ill prepared for that attention, and how we can inadvertently do harmful things while we're in the spotlight. So I hold that advice and those ideas in tension with my understanding that I am uniquely positioned to speak to and expose transphobia within faith communities. I am convinced, based on the findings of researchers of LGBTQ plus youth and religion and suicidal ideation, that my story could save people's lives. But my story is just that. It's my story. I have memories related to my gender from when I was probably 5 or 6 years old. I did not have the understanding in those days to say something like, I think I'm supposed to be a girl. And even if I had, I would have been absolutely terrified to say it. I grew up attending a Baptist church in a small North Carolina town. The church proudly described itself as fundamentalist, and I was in the building 6 days a week for worship services on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings. And I also went there for grade school at their private Christian academy. I was in kindergarten there when I got my first girlfriend. I don't remember the little girl's name, honestly. I don't remember especially wanting a girlfriend, but she seemed to have wanted me, as I recall. And in the context of a 1980s kindergarten classroom at my Christian elementary school, being a couple meant hanging out together during free play time. And I remember free play being a pretty gendered enterprise. The boys did their thing, the girls did theirs, unless you were a couple. So I got to spend the afternoon during free play time with this little girl, surrounded, as I recall, by other little girls, listening to her talk about Cabbage Patch Kids. I didn't have a Cabbage Patch Kid, but I found them really interesting for some reason. And so I listened to the history of one of the 1980s most popular dolls, and it occurred to me somehow on some unexpressible level that I was in the right place. Another time, my mom took me and my 3 siblings to a friend's house for a visit and a play date, friend from church. And my baby brother, who was a toddler at the time and not potty trained, had an accident. And somehow my mom, keeping up with 4 little kids must have been a lot sometimes, forgot to pack extra clothes. Oh, that's okay, my mom's friend said. He can borrow some of Meredith's clothes. Now, Meredith, as you may be assuming, was a girl. My brother is a boy. He was venturing, unaware and by pure accident, to the other side of the gender spectrum, and my little mind was just blown. You can do that? I thought to myself. The pink underwear is an option for people like me? I want that. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old at the time. I never said a thing about it. I think I probably found my own thoughts unsettling, in fact, and they've stuck with me all these years. A couple years later, at 11, I was away for the first time at a sleepaway camp on an island in a lake in the middle of upstate New York. I was a brand new member of the youth group at my church, and by the end of that week, I knew that I wanted to do with my life what my youth pastor was doing with his life, namely to remind people, help them see that they are beloved children of God. This was kind of my call to ministry. But at the end of the week, I also knew that I was supposed to be a girl. It was a boy's side of the island and a girl's side of the island, and I was on the wrong side. I knew when I ventured home from camp later that I could only ever talk about one of the revelations I had the week before and never the other one. The other one, I had to hide that. I had to ignore it. I had to repress it. I had to hope and pray that it would disappear and that it was only a phase. That was a long time ago. 30 years, almost exactly, summer of 1990. And even though those 30 years make up the biggest chunk of my life, and even though I made a lot out of those 30 years, I could summarize them by saying that I dedicated those years to listening to one voice while trying to silence the other. I once described the situation to my therapist by saying, it's like there's a dam with 2 big holes in it. I can put my hand over one of those holes. I can plug it and I can stop the leaking. But the other hole is just out of reach. And so I have to choose to patch one or the other. I chose to patch the hole of vocation, but the hole of gender, I guess, if you want to call it, just kept on leaking and leaking and leaking. I tended to one deep need in my soul while totally ignoring the other. And what that looked like for someone seeking to become a Protestant evangelical pastor was what looked like a heteronormative relationship, the archetypal wife and 2 kids that pastor search committees love to see. It was getting a bachelor's degree and then a master of divinity. It was working as much as I could in congregational ministry, first as a youth minister, and then as kind of a guest preacher, then as an adult ministries intern at a very large Baptist church, then briefly as an associate pastor, and then finally as a senior pastor. This was my single-minded pursuit for years. But over the years, I was troubled by a sense that something was wrong. Sometimes I just called it the darkness. I struggled to understand it sometimes. Sometimes it felt like depression or like loneliness, like my work didn't matter, like my life didn't matter. I didn't know how to connect any of that pain with gender dysphoria, with the pain of living as a man when you're actually a woman. And so when I talked to my doctor or to my therapist or to a close friend, the loose ends never connected. A few years ago, my dad had a knee replacement operation, and during recovery, the surgeon said to him, "It took us longer than it should have to finish the replacement because it turns out you have a torn meniscus. And from the looks of it, you'd been walking around on a torn meniscus for a long while." "Oh," my dad said. "Well, I'm in my 60s now, and I've been pretty hard on my knees, and I thought that's just what they were supposed to feel like." I am my father's daughter, because up until I was 39 years old, I figured that I was just a cisgender man dealing with a lot of inner struggle, feeling oddly disconnected from life, and with a lifelong wish that he could be a woman. I didn't know enough about what it meant to be transgender to consider that I might be trans. I thought the pain of walking around as the wrong person was just garden variety existential angst, I guess. And then I moved to Canada. I took a really great job at what I thought was a wonderful church. I kind of felt like the hotshot mid who gets to be successful in a pretty coveted position. I was making more money than I ever had before. I was living in a world-class metropolitan area. I was working far outside the context of my fundamentalist Southern upbringing. And besides that, I was stepping into a job my predecessors had held for more than a decade each. "I want to be here for a very long time," I said to the congregation when I first started, and we all thought that was a lovely idea. But soon, life at what I once considered the top of my aspirations proved to be just as prone to those seasons of darkness as before. Struggles were still there. The loneliness intensified because now I lived hundreds of miles from my family and closest friends, and I was still, so I thought, just a cisgender man who really wanted to be a woman. And then one year, I volunteered to be the manager of my oldest kid's hockey team. I wasn't coaching, I was just managing the snack calendar and booking the hotel for tournaments and stuff like that. But as an adult volunteer, I had to complete a webinar on gender discrimination. And for the first time, I learned in kind of a laid out systematic manner about ideas like assigned gender, gender identity, gender expression. And I learned about gender dysphoria in a way that made sense to me. I turned those ideas over and over in my mind, and by the time the season ended, I was ready to accept that something was up with my gender. I didn't want to think of myself as trans, not yet, but I was ready to say, you know what? I need to take my senses seriously. And so on Friday, April the 13th, 2018, I got in my car, left my office at my church. I drove to the Glad Day bookstore in Toronto, which is the oldest queer bookstore in North America. I found an employee and I said through tears, "I have questions about my gender identity. What do you think I should be reading?" Now, the person gave me a couple of suggestions, but since they could see I was troubled, they also said, "Well, you know, the LGBTQ community center is just up the block and you can talk to somebody there about getting help." And so I went. A couple of weeks later, I had an intake appointment. A couple of weeks after that, I was seeing a therapist to talk finally about being trans. A couple weeks after that, my therapist was calling me Alexandria, the name that I tried out before landing on June. A couple of weeks after that, I was starting to come out to my friends. A couple of weeks after that, I was going to therapy presenting female, actually going out into the world with my hair down and in makeup and in women's clothing as myself. All the while, I was terrified about what it would look like to come out at work, to come out to my congregation. Now, Canada has a lot of room for improvement, but on a global scale, it's a pretty good place to be transgender. Trans rights are enshrined in our Charter of Rights. Trans affirming healthcare is often covered under our socialized medicine. Cities like Vancouver and Toronto are known to be fairly accepting. There's a cliche, in fact, in the Canadian LGBTQ plus community about moving to Toronto and to come out. I guess I did that. I didn't know I was doing that. But faith communities don't reflect this openness even here in Canada. And trans women pastors were and are anomalies worldwide. I've been told that there are about 300 transgender clergy in North America, but once you narrow that category to binary trans women like myself, who are working as lead pastors, as I once did, it's a very small number. But the stories are out there. You can search up Paula Stone Williams and watch her TED Talk and even read her memoir when it comes out sometime next year, June, I think she told me. You can find articles and interviews with Allison Robinson, the Baptist pastor who worked for the Human Rights Committee and appeared on the show I Am Kate. You can find stories about my friends Erica Saunders and Donnie Anderson, who are wonderful pastors, but neither working full-time in ministry. Here in Canada, trans women like Christina Bell-Smith and Ruth Wood managed to find work as pastors, but not until they had been let go by the congregations that they came out to. As I got to know these stories of trans women pastors, I began to notice some common themes. Loss of a job was one of the big themes. Being silenced was one of the others. I discovered the stories of women who chose to resign from their clergy positions in order to focus on coming out and transitioning. Women who didn't want to create controversy or draw undesirable attention. I found stories of women who came out to select leaders in their churches and then, under pressure from those leaders, went away without ever getting to face their communities and tell their stories. I read stories about people who prioritize security and peace, and I think that those are perfectly reasonable decisions, frankly. I spoke to one very high-ranking leader in a progressive denomination here in Canada, someone who had lost his job in Baptist life when he was outed as gay, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And when I told him that I was planning to come out and transition someday, he cautioned me to think about my future and the safety of my family before I did anything publicly. Now, by the time I started really making plans to come out and transition, my congregation was starting a year-long celebration of its 100th anniversary. It started in May of 2019 and was planned to kind of culminate in May of 2020. Now, I recognize the significance of these celebrations. I wanted those to proceed without interruption, and I knew that whether they embraced me or not, I didn't want my congregation to have to deal with such a big announcement during that centennial year. So I gave myself space and I gave myself time to plan, to just get more practice being out in the world as myself, to go to therapy more times, to get more hair removal. It's a big thing. To spend more time taking hormones and give those changes more space to occur, to come out to more of my close friends and to build a larger network of support. I targeted June of 2020 as my coming out date. I decided that I was going to come out to everyone, the whole congregation, at one time with nobody getting the news in advance. And I was going to do it in a Sunday sermon. The onset of coronavirus changed my plans a bit, but not as significantly as I first thought. We shifted our worship services to a virtual online format, and soon I realized that these new conditions would allow me to speak to a bigger congregation than I had ever reached before. Coronavirus also gave me a window to embody myself a little more than I expected. By the end of March, I wasn't going into the office anymore, and I'd pretty much socially transitioned. I presented mail as best as I could on Zoom calls for work, but otherwise, I was June, presented as June, around the house, to my partner, to my kids, in a mask, in line at the grocery store. My family knew I was June, my friends knew I was June, and soon my church was going to know. I chose to come out the way that I did for a couple of reasons. And here's where I think we may be able to reconnect some of those graces that I mentioned earlier. Here's where authenticity and vulnerability and visibility play a key role. First, I came out the way that I did because I'd been advocating for greater LGBTQ plus inclusion in faith communities for almost 20 years. Ever since 2003, when the student life director at my seminary, a cisgender straight man, was forced to resign for refusing to out LGBTQ plus students when seminary leadership saw them as violating the school's code of ethics. I was angry, and so I spoke to the seminary president about it. And I was told more or less just to wait, that the optics of welcoming LGBTQ plus students would cost us too much. People would stop giving money to the seminary, and that the issue wasn't safe for 2003. Every time the topic came up in my subsequent ministry, the same sense of delay showed up. Just a couple of weeks ago, in October, I was in a denominational meeting, Canadian Baptist of Ontario and Quebec, that's still my denominational home technically. And there were these three really terrible motions, anti-LGBTQ plus motions being debated. And they all got defeated, I'm grateful to say. But for two of the three motions, someone spoke up to say, can't we just talk about this some other year? Can't we just wait until we're ready? I don't think we're ready to talk about this. This excuse keeps being made again and again and again, year after year after year. And I knew that if somebody like me came out in a very public way, the conversations were going to happen. And not just in my church, in other churches, other denominations too. I heard from somebody who said that they had sent a letter to the leaders at their church that said, you know, June's story has us rethinking our faith. And we realized that she wouldn't be welcome as a pastor here. And so we're not going to go to this church anymore. Secondly, I came out the way I did because I recognized that this was literally a life or death situation. I know that LGBTQ plus kids are being traumatized and abused by religious family members. I know that they are ending their own lives, and I know that being in a religious environment increases the chances of that happening. And so I wanted to use my platform, a platform that not many trans clergy are given, to say to my trans siblings, you are beloved. I am an ordained pastor, someone upon whom the church has laid hands and said, you can speak for us. And I'm telling you that God knows you as you are, calls you by name, even if nobody else calls you by the right name, and loves you deeply. And third and finally, I plan to come out the way I did because I wanted to put a human face on something that too many people of faith think of as a theoretical issue. Churches often debate LGBTQ plus inclusion the way they debate over like who wrote the book of Genesis or whether we should baptize people by sprinkling them or dunking them under the water. But we're not an issue. We're human beings. I read in a book called God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Vines that one of the greatest gifts that LGBTQ plus Christians can give the church is simply themselves, unapologetically. And so on Sunday morning, June 14th of this year, I preached a sermon on Matthew chapter 13 on Jesus's parable about a pearl that's so precious, the person looking for it, when he finally finds it, sells everything to get it. I read in a book called Beyond a Binary God, a Theology for Trans Allies, that trans identities are often like that pearl. It's a treasure, it's a precious treasure, but claiming it can cost us everything, literally everything. It was the scariest sermon that I've ever delivered, but I felt such tremendous relief as I finished. And then the whirlwind began. Eventually, I lost my job. Baptists generally make decisions by congregational vote. And when the vote was held as to whether or not I got to keep my job, the votes to fire me numbered 58, and the votes to keep me numbered 53. I've stayed really busy since, though. I got fired on July the 20th, and I preached for a friend's church virtually, kind of like I'm with you today. Her church is in New Orleans the Sunday after. And I think, I haven't done the math yet, but it looks like I will have preached as many sermons as there are Sundays left in the year. I have an occasional Sunday off, but there are weeks like last week where I preached 3 different sermons, and well, 2 different sermons in 3 different churches. I sent the same version to 2 different churches, but I'm staying pretty busy. It's kind of a miracle. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do next, but I'm staying fairly busy. But like those daughters that show up at the end of the book of Job, I feel like transition has brought these 3 graces into my life in a new and meaningful way. Authenticity. I feel like I just can't ignore myself and my senses anymore. I keep thinking about my dad and his knee, and it's not the only time. I saw this post online about a week ago, and it was a sign that said something like, "This year 2,000 men will die from stubbornness," and somebody had spray painted underneath, "No, we won't." I don't know if that was printed on the sign or whether that was part of the joke or whatever, but I think my dad embodies something that a lot of folks of maybe of his age and gender embody, and it's the sense that like you just have to play hurt. He recently wrecked his bicycle. Bystanders called the ambulance. When the ambulance showed up, he said, "No, I'm good," and he went home. And like a day later, my mom convinced him to go to the hospital, and at the hospital, the doctor said, "Well, sir, you have broken your neck." So my dad just, when he's hurt, he just won't accept it. He won't admit it. I don't think that's a good thing. In fact, I think transition requires the exact opposite approach. I spent decades of my life saying, "Oh, I'm okay. I'm okay. This is nothing. I'm just, like I said, I'm just the cisgender guy who really wants to be a woman." And I don't have to take that sense seriously. But until I reach that point of taking myself seriously and living authentically, I couldn't make it into transition. Vulnerability is important too. I'm really willing to be open about the ups and the downs. I have a friend that says it's okay not to be okay, and sometimes I'm not okay. I told my congregation during that brief window when it kind of looked like I might keep my job, I said, "Folks, this is going to be really awkward. You've known me as a different person, kind of, for 6 years. You've used a different name, different pronouns. You've assumed that I was a guy, and I'm not. And it's going to be weird being together. You're going to call me by the wrong name. You're going to call me by the wrong pronouns. Some of you don't know anything about trans people, and you're going to make wrong assumptions, and you might feel really bad about that, or you might not. I don't know. But I want you to know that I want to give you some space to do that, so that we can kind of lean into the awkwardness together and embrace that. I'm okay being pretty open about those ups and downs. I've kind of explored my identity and made a lot of good connections on social media, Twitter especially. And for the folks who follow me on Twitter, I think they realize that if I'm having a bad day, I'm pretty open about it. I don't try to put up a front and pretend like things are okay when they're not okay. And every time I post something about like, "Oh, this is really hard," and yeah, sometimes transition is really hard, folks will respond to me, message me, and say, "Thanks for helping me realize that it's okay to be that way." One of the first trans women I reached out to a long time ago when I really wasn't sure where I was going, sent her an email, and she responded and said, "This is going to be really tough." And she was one of the few people that was very honest with me about that stuff. And I reconnected with her recently, and I said, "You know what? I don't know if you remember me, but I emailed you a couple of years ago, and you responded to say this is going to be hard." And she said, "Yep." It sure is. And I'm in the middle of the first year now, and there are days that are just really tough. And I don't mind modeling that. I don't mind embodying that. I don't mind people seeing that. And I don't think it means that I'm weak or that I'm doing it wrong. And then visibility. I am okay with attention. I'm okay doing interviews. I'm okay saying this is who I am and this is what happened to me, because I think visibility is a powerful tool for liberation. I think that often, especially within faith communities, really kind of bad decisions get made, and then folks just assume we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it. One of the most prominent stories of a pastor coming out and getting fired, I was reading it, and I mentioned her already, Paula Stone Williams. And when you read her story in the New York Times, and I guess this is kind of the same thing in mine, it's amazing how the folks who fired her and the folks who fired me just want to say no comment, no comment, no comment, no comment. They kind of rely on folks not paying attention. But I wanted to come out the way that I would so that folks would see, folks would pay attention. There were people at my church who said, wait a minute, our bulletin says all are welcome. Our sign says all are welcome. You mean you've not been honest with us? That, you know, you might exclude somebody because they're trans? I thought I was in a welcoming community. It turns out I'm not. So churches aren't always honest and visible about what they believe. As a matter of fact, mega churches are kind of all over North America, and they're notoriously untransparent when it comes to their convictions on LGBTQ plus people. It's very hard to get a straight answer from any leadership at most mega churches about whether or not they're accepting or not. They're almost always not accepting, but they try to couch it in language that makes it sound like, you know, it's okay to be there. And I know a lot of queer people that go to mega churches because of that lack of transparency, because they don't know. A kind of final thought that I want to share is that I think these graces are not just for transgender people. I hope that this is one of those places that trans people have important insight and maybe some wisdom to share with cisgender people that are not transgender. So much of our conditioning, social conditioning, whatever, tells us not to listen to ourselves. Tells us, like I said, to not take our feelings seriously or to play hurt, so to speak. There's great virtue in getting hurt and pretending like you didn't get hurt. And I just think that's, I don't know, I think there's something wrong with that. And if we're authentic, we need to be open about our struggles. We need to be vulnerable also. I don't really think that the future belongs to great people in like the Thomas Carlyle great man sense. Carlyle wrote that history is just the stories of great men. And these men are often these just one-dimensional superhero types. I think we are learning more and more that that's not really the way the story goes. I think we need more folks that are willing to kind of deconstruct that paradigm and live into their own vulnerabilities and to be open about that. Sometimes it's really scary and awkward and isolating. Sometimes life is all those things. I think we can somehow make life more humane when we acknowledge these things instead of pretending they don't exist. Like I said, every time I'm open about my own struggles, people who identify with that struggle are helped along. And you know, like I said, sometimes transition sucks. Sometimes it's really hard. And you know, there are folks out there who are willing to say, hey, I came out this year and my life has never been better. And I'm like, hey, that's great. I came out this year and like, I'm really struggling and I'm hoping that it gets better. And then visibility it can be a hard one because visibility can be dangerous. Trans Day of Remembrance is on Friday of this week. And it's a reminder, a sad reminder that sometimes visibility can be deadly. But like I said, it's also a powerful tool for liberation and equality. As more and more of us are visible, there's more strength that we can draw from, and the more formidable we become as a community. And that, you know, like I said, that goes for the trans community and other communities as well. So I have been helped. You know, my story is still being written. I do think it's kind of, sometimes it's a bit overwhelming because this is all so new to me, but I do try to hold those three things, those three graces: visibility, vulnerability and authenticity. And I hope you can see where those are happening in my story, and I hope you can find places to connect to your own story. So thanks again for having me, and I think I'm willing to answer whatever questions you might have.
Thanks so much, June, for sharing your story. Hopefully lots of folks here, we've actually got a pretty good group here now, have questions for you. I'll start off with one to let everyone have just a second to think of what their questions might be. My question is, I don't know how much feedback you got from that really close vote, actually, from your former congregation, but to what extent was the obstacle that you're trans, and to what extent was it simply being a woman?
That's a really great question. Part of what my coming out exposed at my church, and this is probably the case in a lot of communities, faith communities and elsewhere around the continent, is that in the interest of just like everybody getting along, let's just all be friends, we didn't talk about anything important for like 30 years. And so we had these two kind of different congregations coexisting under the same steeple. And there was one congregation that really didn't even think that cisgender people should be pastors, even though our denomination had been ordaining women since the 1940s. And so I do think that even in those religious traditions that are officially, like on paper, welcoming of women, my cisgender women colleagues have really struggled to land meaningful jobs and to keep those jobs. And so I think a lot of folks could testify to similar experience in other fields.
Anyone has a question, you can raise your hand by hitting the little hand button. Just to warn you, you have to also put your hand down or it will stay up for the rest of our discussion. Yeah, Leland.
So I guess it's probably a little early to ask this question because this is kind of all very, very recent. But I'm wondering about, if you have any kind of feelings of maybe resentment towards the church and kind of, this has been something that you've devoted your life to, or at least a big chunk of your life to. And now it seems like, at least in this particular situation, you're kind of being booted out for being honest about who you are.
Yeah.
And it seems like you're still optimistic though. And it seems like, maybe a lesser person would be like, oh, screw them, I'm just angry and resentful. But you don't seem to have that, or do you, in some sense?
Yeah, I'd be lying if I said there's not any anger or resentment. I'm trying to figure out how to use that as constructively as I possibly can. And I want to, I don't know. That's a tough question. I think one of the things that makes me especially angry in retrospect, and I'm trying to just take a life lesson from it, is that the executive council at the church, that is like the kind of the board of directors. Some churches would call that the deacons, or what they're called, the executive council in my case. These are the leaders of the church, the ones who were kind of in the driver's seat when, here's how we're going to approach this, here's how we're going to talk about this leading up to the vote. They made it their goal to remain neutral, like to just kind of be a neutral presence no matter what was done and what was said. And especially when it comes to issues of transphobia, neutrality is terrible. It's insidious. There are so many trans people will tell you that transphobia is when you take kind of a neutral position, makes a lot of space. Well, in issues related to transphobia, neutrality just makes space for kind of awful stuff. I think along similar lines, I've learned this not just by experience, but one of the most recent books I read, which thankfully it seems like a lot of people are reading these days, is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, and he makes the point that there's no neutrality here. Neutrality is not okay. You're either racist or you're anti-racist, and if you are in the middle, basically what you're saying is racism is okay. I can make space for this, and I think there's probably a pretty similar I don't know, spectrum when it comes to transphobia. That neutrality can be insidious. And so that's one of the things I'm kind of angry about, and maybe even resentful, but definitely I'm trying to take those lessons and like remind churches that like it's not okay to set on the fence, and just people anywhere. It's not okay to set on the fence with this. This is not, that trans people exist, that trans women are women, that trans men are men, that non-binary people are who they say they are. You don't get to debate that. And so like a neutral position there is not okay.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So I'm also curious about, you've been in the media doing these kind of things for the past, 2-3 months or so now. That's how, I came to see you because I saw you on CBC, I think it was. And, you speak about the neutrality kind of at those higher levels of the church, but I'm wondering if you being out there, your story getting out there is starting to change some minds, if you've been able to see any of that kind of coming out in the past little while since you've been speaking, or are they still kind of staying kind of firmly entrenched in that sense of neutrality?
The church can be a really frustrating place. I have clergy colleagues who are supportive of me in theory, but like also kind of afraid of keeping their jobs. So like, part of the process of coming out was realizing that you've got some friends that are going to stick their neck out for you, and some friends that it's hard to fault them. I mean, I want to be angry, but I know what it's like to want to keep your job and to want to keep your well-being, who are not able to be as public about it. So I hope that some change has happened. I think one of the changes that has happened is just, a lot of people left my former church. We had 5 people on the pastoral staff. I was fired, and 2 others immediately resigned in solidarity. Our board of directors, again, there were 8 of them, and 7 of them resigned. Some of them resigned just simply because, like, they're people with kind of public-facing careers and the public pressure. Like, one of them works at a college here in Ontario, and his board of directors said, "Look, you can't be on the board of directors of an organization that fired a woman for being trans." So, he had to step down, and so those kinds of things have happened. But I don't know how much other change has happened. I hope that, well, institutionally, that is, I think it's changed the way some people personally think. Sometimes it's hard to extrapolate that out to institutional change.
Jennifer, go ahead. For those who don't know, Jennifer is a professor in the Division of Education.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out which camera I'm using. Hi. I'm Jennifer Heisler, yes, in the Division of Education as a full-time faculty member. I want to speak to the fear that you just talked about, as well as courage. So my youngest daughter, I have 3 adult children, and my youngest daughter is gay, and I don't think that she's necessarily transgender, but the courage that it took her to say, "Mom, I'm gay," was insane. But as her mother, as family, there's nothing that she could say yet that would change that love that I have for her and the acceptance of who she is. So while you might have been thinking people didn't know, they probably knew before you even said so. You just affirmed what they maybe thought. So just wanted to give that to you, and that this sense of fear, just saying this out loud to this community of Catholics, and so I come from a Catholic tradition, an extremely conservative Catholic family, and consider myself a pretty conservative Catholic, but I also wholeheartedly believe that everybody, all of us, were born and made in the image and likeness of God, and God loves us all just the way we are, and we shouldn't try to hide that beauty. And so, as a teacher educator, could you give me some insight into how do people, teachers, help form young people? Obviously, you talked about knowing this at a very young age, but how do we set a sense of openness or acceptance for all, even at the young age? And can educators help set that stage?
Well, I think that visibility helps. I mentioned that as one of the graces. I think as trans people, when I was a kid, depictions of trans people were exceedingly rare, and the few that I would have encountered would have been associated with a lot of stigma. Think like, they were usually the villains in movies, or kind of there as almost like a sideshow on like trash TV, Jerry Springer, stuff like that. And there was never any sense that like these were human beings with like dignity and agency, and that they were brave. They were just kind of to be gawked at. And so I think I was in my 30s before I ever saw a trans person depicted in positive light. And that was probably Allison Robinson, the pastor that I mentioned. She was ordained in 2014, 2015, just as I was moving here to Canada. She was ordained by Calvary Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. And I think as trans people become more and more visible, and folks can see, it's okay to be trans. It's not. It is not this. I hesitate to use the word scary, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, it's not this scary unknown thing. I think goes a long way towards acceptance. I love seeing good trans representation in like media, in books and stuff like that. I have two boys, and last summer we checked out a book from the library, and it was called something like Stories for Boys Who Dare to Be Different. And one of the men in the book was a trans man whose name escapes me, but who transitioned like in the 1910s or 20s, and was a college professor and a writer. And I think he was instrumental in like developing treatments for tuberculosis. And about midway through his life, testosterone hormone replacement therapy became widely available, and so he got to start taking testosterone. It was such an amazing story, but just to be included alongside other really amazing men from history was pretty cool. So I think that's one way to do it. And I don't know, beyond that, I mean, I'm not an educator technically, but I think it's helpful to, I guess, when you talk to your kids about issues of, one thing, and I'm trying to not ramble too much, but I know like here in Ontario, and I'm sure it's like this in different jurisdictions in the States, like the sex ed curriculum that was rolled out a couple of years ago, when there was a Liberal government here in Ontario, mentioned gender identity at a pretty young age as part of the sex ed curriculum. And a lot of religious folks really balked at that. And I think kids are ready. Trans kids know who they are often, I mean, almost always by the time they're 12, usually even younger. And so knowing about that as adults, volunteers with kids, and knowing how to affirm them and make safe spaces for them, I think is really important. Interestingly, I think that there are an awful lot of religious people, a lot of Catholics especially. I'm not Catholic. I'm barely Catholic adjacent, who would reflect your convictions about, I think of myself as a Catholic through and through, but there's a lot about it that I really disagree with. I've gotten to know a lot of I've talked to a couple of clergy, especially since coming out, who would say, like, on a personal level, most of the clergy think that this stuff, this discrimination, this stigma is wrong, but they don't know what to do about it. And I think that's sad. I've often said, like, if all the allies would just come out, and then also if all the closeted queer clergy would just come out, there would be a revolution in the church. But that's another topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the church has, in many ways, the Catholic Church and other Christian churches have sort of backed themselves into this weird corner where they're so afraid of condoning transgender people and homosexual acts that they also have become fearful of advocating for any sorts of LGBTQ rights, even when they don't offend the church's values, right? So the Catholic Church would not be on board with an individual being transgender. It doesn't really recognize the sort of difference between one's gender and one's biological sex. But at the same time, there's nothing in Catholic Church theology that would say, therefore, a trans person should have extra obstacles receiving medical care, right?
Yeah.
The Catholic Church should be completely on board with wanting everyone to have access to medical care.
I think that's.
But they're afraid to talk about it because it's wrapped up in these other issues.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Pope Francis is a fascinating kind of case study on transness, because on one hand, like, you see headlines about him really kind of endearing himself to certain corners of the trans community in Italy, and like referring to them by the right name and gender and stuff like that. But then, there was like a document that came out a couple of years ago, male and female, he created them, that would just basically said, like, trans people are kind of like kind of like nuclear armament and kind of like global warming, and that they reflect humanity's capacity for destroying the creation. And it was just like, really, like, I'm not the same as nuclear arms. I don't think any reasonable human being can come to that conclusion. But doctrinally, it's like they're being forced into that place, and it's very frustrating.
At what point in this journey were you able to encounter queer theology?
Oh, that's a great question. Pretty early. I'm very fortunate. I mean, and gosh, I'm not as deeply ingrained as I hope to be. There's always more to learn, but I became self-accepting at about the same time that a book called Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians was published by a trans Bible scholar named Austin Hartke. And Austin and I have actually gotten to know one another in the years since then. And discovering the absolute renaissance in like queer Bible scholarship, in queer like preaching and queer theology, queer church leadership, just over the last 20 or 30 years, and maybe even more, has been such a delightful thing, because so many of those voices are writing from a place of marginalization, and there's something about what they are seeing and experiencing that I think makes the scripture come alive. I've been connected for a number of years to an organization called the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, which I think some people are surprised to even know exists. And I remember having a conversation with their executive director some years ago, before I was self-accepting, before I was out, when I just thought I was just a really good ally. And I said to her, Robin, when I hear you speak, it's almost like I'm hearing the gospel proclaimed for the first time, because like there are no strings attached. Like God loves you no matter who you are. It's not like God loves you, but no, some restrictions apply. So discovering that and kind of stepping into the fullness of it has been a tremendous gift.
Go ahead, Joe. Joe is one of my colleagues in the religious studies department.
Hello. I hope you can hear me. First, I want to thank you for your courage and a wonderful, wonderful talk. I typed my question in the chat because I couldn't find my option to raise my hand, but I did find it. So now I can give you my question. I'm the father of 3 children. One of my children is non-binary, gender fluid, and my concern is that so much of the public image of Christian people portrays us as judgmental and exclusionary, and I just really want my child to value ecclesial community and find a place in it. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice for us, for myself and my child, in terms of, how to resist the temptation to just kick the church to the curb and say, I'm done with it all.
That is a huge temptation. I have often said that I'm kind of jealous of my trans women sisters who have become atheists, but I can't quite get there. Even though there is kind of this narrative, I was reading an article today about religious authoritarianism. I think it was in the New York Times, about how like the outcome of the election is not going to do anything about religious authoritarianism, that like folks are just likely to kind of play this persecution narrative for the next 4 years, now that their favored party is not necessarily in power. So there is this kind of story that gets repeated again and again and again. But then there's another layer. I'm from Sawmills, North Carolina, a little rural town in western North Carolina, 3,000 people. And I never knew about it growing up, but almost every church I grew up around was Baptist, and most of them were like really conservative fundamentalist Baptist. But there was this little church, started out of a gay bar in Hickory, North Carolina. I never knew there was a gay bar in Hickory, North Carolina. Hickory was like the city in the town next county over, in the county next, was the big city in the next county. That's what I'm trying to say. And there was this, very nondescript gay bar, and a church started there in that gay bar. And now, I don't know, 20, 30 years later, they have a building. It's a pretty vibrant congregation. My aunts, who are married, got married as soon as marriage equality passed in North Carolina, are active members of the church. One of my aunts is like the chair of their church council. And that's in like the middle of nowhere, almost rural western North Carolina. And so they must be everywhere. As you get into more populated areas, I know, like if you're walking around Toronto or driving around Toronto, probably every other church you pass has a rainbow flag out on the sign, especially if it's a United Church or sometimes Anglicans up here. So there's community to be found. It just, like a lot of things, it's not the first thing that you find. And I think some of the same disclaimers that we often tell people that are not, that are cisgender and straight, that, the church is not a perfect place. I'm trying to learn to live with that, because I think I'm going to end up working in a church again. And what I'm finding from my queer clergy colleagues is that, their churches might be welcoming and affirming. It might be okay to be gay. It might be okay to be trans, might be okay to be non-binary, but there's still a lot of drama, and there's still a lot of politics, and there's still a lot of struggles. And so you're never going to escape those things. But there is still something really precious about that community when we get it right.
Yeah, thanks. Sarah Shrenko in the chat sort of echoed your sentiment, Joe, saying, I feel that the church's Christianity's silence on these matters is hindering the church going forward. I have so many friends that I grew up with that have walked away from the church because of how we were raised was so right or wrong. They don't see the church as accepting, and because of that, they want no part of it. I'm so appreciative of you sharing your story. That's for you, June. Thank you. Yeah.
It's, I there are a lot of issues and questions, I guess, to address when it comes to churches. My best friend is the pastor of the St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church in New Orleans, and she and I were on staff together in Richmond for a while. And there's this Presbyterian Church in America, one of the conservative branches of Presbyterianism, that rents their sanctuary like an hour or two before they worship on Sunday morning. Well, they don't do it now because of COVID, but in the time when that was a thing. And there's a Black trans woman that goes to that super conservative Presbyterian church. And my friend Elizabeth has gotten to know this woman. And she said, theologically, I like you a lot better. I like your preaching. I like who you are. Elizabeth is now serving on like some trans advocacy committee in Louisiana. I'm really proud of her for that. But this woman said to her, but like, y'all sing like classical music and your choir wears robes and you play the organ. And so like, worship is fun at this other church. And so I don't even know what to make of that story. The funny thing about that conservative Presbyterian church is they're all about taking Instagram photos of the trans woman that goes to their church to say, hey, look how diverse they are, even though their theology very explicitly says that she is sinful. I don't know. I just kind of sit and chew on that story and think about it and wonder, well, what does it say about the church and acceptance and who we are? And I honestly don't know.
Leland.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think we're kind of coming up on the end of our time pretty shortly here. So I was going to say, if anybody had maybe one more question or so, we can put that out there and then, move on. Or did we get to everything?
Well, I would just say to any of the students tuning in, if you need more on queer theology or gender theory, there are several faculty members on this conversation. Leland, myself, Joe Rab, Tim Henkel. Are you listening or just doing tech? I don't know. But hit any one of us up and we'll get you what you need.
Yeah, I agree. And, just by sheer luck of scheduling this week in my philosophy of race and gender course, we're dealing with how trans representation in the media. So that kind of pairs up nicely for some of my students who are from that class who were able to tune in and check this out. So let's thank Reverend Junia Joplin for her time today. And, it was a great talk. And like I said, I will post this video when we get it available and kind of put together in the right place. Reverend Joplin will get a copy as well, so you can take a look at it if you'd like. And it will be available on the, EGS website and wherever else we need to put it. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. And thank you, Reverend Joplin, for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been good to be with you.